Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am Professor Bwisa, Henry Bwisa of Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology. I now want to present part 3 of the same question that is in part 1 and part 2. Can Bukusu culture afford to be static? Part 1 of this story can be found at that link, part 2 at the other link. This is the link for part 1 and this is the link for part 2. And this is part 3. I keep repeating, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a historian, I'm not an expert in culture. And therefore, as I attempt to answer the question, can Bukusu culture afford to be static? I'm using my own life history. I consulted some documents. I asked and listened to some people. I observed some rituals and ceremonies. And there is a Bukusu caucus WhatsApp group which is very rich in discussion on Bukusu. And finally, I applied my own logic to generate this series of my story. In part 1, I defined culture. In part 2, I traced a brief migration history of the Bukusu from Egypt Esibakala in the 6 AD to Muyala Wamango in Kenya, Uganda in the 14th, 15th, thereabout century. Now in this part 3, I want to look at food as an element of culture. Yes, again, ask me about the key pillars of culture and I will tell you food as one pillar, house or houses and language is another pillar, clothes, rituals. In other words, culture is not just one element. Culture is many things put together as I defined it in my first part. So now let's look at the food that we eat. Yes, different people and different cultures therefore eat different foods. So food is an element of culture. At that document, at that source, I found this information that people connect to their cultural or ethnic group through food patterns. Food is used as a means of retaining a people's cultural identity. People from different cultural backgrounds eat different foods. The areas in which families live and where their ancestors originated influence food likes and dislikes. These food preferences result in patterns of food choices within a cultural or even regional group. So what we're saying is that food is a very important aspect of culture. Now let us look at some key Kenyan foods. Yes, talk of fish, talk of omena, and you are most likely identifying yourself with the Luo in Kenya. Mokimo, talk of Mokimo, and you are in Kikuyu land. Talk of Izagig, then you are in Kalenjin. Talk of Pilau, you are at the coast. You can see these foods are related with a people and therefore a culture. Therefore, food is an aspect of culture. Now, at Esibakala, in the first century, the Bukusu practiced farming and grew millet, sorghum, cassava, sweet potatoes, bananas, but not maize. They also grew traditional vegetables, but not sukuma wiki. So maize is not a traditional Bukusu crop. Maize was imported into Kenya, not just Bukusu land, into Kenya in the 19th century. So, these crops that you see, the sorghum, the millet, the arrowroots on the right, do inform us of the types of food that the Bukusu ate. Let's sample them. Yes, you can see porridge down here, millet, porridge, and the millet was ground on a stone. You can see. There are other foods, brown millet ugali with mushrooms, with termites. You can see termites, we call them chiswa, on our plate here. There is cassava, there is chinunga, the traditional sucha, mrenda, and all that. Of course, mushrooms, sweet potatoes. These were some of the traditional Bukusu food. Note that there is no white or maize ugali here. The vegetables you are seeing there, they are not sukuma wiki. These are traditional foods. So we're saying, long after Esibakala, a foreign grain, maize, or nasimia in Bukusu, was introduced, and so was its more efficient grinding technology, the portion mills. You saw here that the grinding of the grain was like cumbersome, on a stone, very labor intensive, could take time. Come maize and also portion mills came, technology more efficient, so to speak, and therefore slowly the grains that were supposed to be ground on stones were being put in the parking lot, so to speak, and therefore ugali from maize flour started replacing millet and sorghum at the tables of many Bukusu people. Here, therefore, is an example of adoption of new elements of culture, and this supports my hypothesis that culture is dynamic. Indeed, it's not just my hypothesis. You saw the documents I've looked at. Quite a number of authors agree or hold it that culture is dynamic. So we're saying, traditionally, Bukusu ate certain foods. 19th century, introduction of maize, and therefore they switched to what we can now see here. That's now ugali, maize, white ugali with the sukuma. We now have chapatis with cabbage, Irish potatoes, and even peas. We now chicken served to all, men, women, children. Later, we shall see that when you come to taboos, we shall see that traditionally, women were not to eat chicken. But today, changing gender roles and all that, women do it again, telling us that culture, elements of culture change. How about drink? Yes, This source tells us few, if any, alcoholic beverages are socially neutral. Every drink is loaded with symbolic meaning. Every drink conveys a message. Alcohol is a symbolic vehicle for identifying, describing, constructing, and manipulating cultural systems, cultural values, and even interpersonal relations, behavioral norms, and expectation. So, drink is also a cultural aspect. Indeed, cultures can be identified by their drinks. Look, this is whiskey, the Scottish whiskey barrels. You see them and you know that is Scotland. Look at that. That is Russian vodka. Look at the measure. And the table is full of snacks. The culture in Russia, and indeed, I studied in the Soviet Union for 10 years. And I can tell you, the drinking habits are pretty different from what I'm experiencing or what I experience here, even in the US or in Britain where I was. So that is vodka in observed two classes. And what's there? Fish is there, potatoes are there, sold items. That is the habit. This is English beer. Look. So these drinks can be identified with cultures. Now, has Bukusu drink evolved? Look at this. Traditionally, the Bukusus were drinking banana drink entirely, made from bananas. And if there was busa or beer, it was millet and sorghum beer. That is traditionally. But today, see, we're drinking Tusker. So we have changed. We have evolved. Malt beer. And this malt was not our crop. Look, we have whiskey, the John Walkers, the vodkas. And even when it is the busa, then it is no longer busa from millet. It is busa from from maize flour. So you can see, even in terms of drink, the Bukusus have changed. The Bukusus have adopted. The Bukusus have adapted. Now, in part 4 of this ongoing story, I look at housing and marriage as elements of culture. You can see we're looking at food, and we have seen that our culture, Bukusu culture, in terms of food, has changed. Therefore, culture is dynamic. Culture is not static. Let's look forward to part 4.